experiences as a parent, kind of equipping my kids mostly from ages 4 through 8 with the tools they need to, grapple with and understand a rapidly expanding world around them, but to do so at their level and to sort of normalize certain components of our society going forward. A lot of it has to do with reckoning with a lot of intergenerational differences, which at the onset of the book, like I'm in my early 40s and I was born at the tail end of Generation X. So when I started work on the book, I really meant for it to be a very short, kind of just raw personal account that was rolling through that first year and a half of the previous administration, and a lot of very rapid fire social and political changes during an authoritarian push. And I assumed that a lot of the way that was going to be filtered, especially as I was thinking about being, a middle-class Southern white kid raised in the 80s by middle-class Southern white Mississippi parents, a lot of growing and learning and dealing with the gaps and holes in the way that my parents and their generation taught me civil rights history, the pros and cons of the ways in which civic engagement and service and duty were taught to me. A lot of that stuff went into the pages of March for me on a personal level. And I tried to inject as much of that kind of reckoning into the storytelling as I could. So I sort of entered this book with that mindset, but it really occurred to me that my generation, very broadly speaking, has a lot more similarities to the baby boomers than millennials, by whom I'm only separated by like 2 years. And I'm speaking very broadly here, but one of the most surprising things had to do with the fact that Generation X and baby boomers, I think, are part of a set that ranges between the end of World War II and 9/11 in terms of carrying certain erroneous assumptions of the inevitable progress of society, a general baseline of consistency, allowing for kind of a safe assumption that at least we'll make it through this until we begin to not make it through it in the very big sense. And so, a lot of it has to do with the ways that in that larger intergenerational sense that affected my teachings as a parent, the ways my family was trying to up our involvement on a civic engagement level. And the essay portions of it are a little more objective and less subjective, and sort of began as independent projects, like the most widely read being an essay called About Face, which has a lot to do with the normalization of fascist and paramilitary symbols and iconography through apolitical or just pop culture and natural, I don't know, like the aesthetic shift towards easily digestible avatar style expressions and projections of identity. The more I started working on the personal memoir work, the more obvious it was that these essays were very much part of the subjective experiences and subjective shifts that I was trying to capture in the book. So it sort of bounces back and forth between these two storytelling perspectives.
And as I know some people are just joining with us. So again, I just kind of wanted to reiterate that we're talking about Nate's new book, Save It for Later. I see this as, and I don't want to put words into your work here, but this is kind of your full circle. This is, the reflection of who we are. It's almost, you read this, and if you haven't read your other work, it still is important. But when you've read everything that you've done, and then you see this, and we were talking about before we started here, we're starting to get to that point, and you're right, where we're starting to become that generation that's taking over and being the leaders, and that's a scary thing. And when you said the gaps and the holes, I mean, my father was a Philadelphia police officer. My father was in the Army. My father talked to me about some things, but we just didn't talk about these things really when I was growing up. We certainly didn't talk about LGBTQ issues, and I didn't know what transgender was. And what I'm saying is, comics, kids want to read these books. And again, they really help us to literally become involved on an emotional level. And reading March and teaching March the last few years, and then reading Save It for Later, I've read it several times now, and it just brought everything together for me. And I have to say, when I first opened it and I saw that you dedicated to John Lewis, like almost right off the bat, it was just, I knew it was going to be emotional. But I love that you're not full of rage, you're not full of hatred, just like John Lewis is, full of love and forgiveness. And it's this idea of, and I love how you begin this book with, hey, listen, this is not a blueprint. I'm not telling you to do exactly what I did, but it really makes us reflect in this graphic novel of, I mean, I literally think we see into your soul, Nate. And I really think you put that out there on the page for us to view, and able to just say, okay, I'm not alone, is such a powerful thing in this time of, especially of quarantine, but even moving forward, to know these things. And so I have to say, and again, Save It for Later, it's out April 6th. Before we get into other topics, I literally want to thank you for the work that you put into this. It can't be easy to bear this to the world.
Well, I mean, part of just being somebody who, this is what I've wanted to do and set out to do since I was like 11 years old. So, the way I'm full of rage too. The way I work it out is usually on the page. So fortunately, in a lot of ways, comics are a very slow endeavor. So, you start with something else in mind, and you're able to kind of temper and work through your thoughts and feelings. And you're able to arrive on the other side by the time you've made a lot of progress on the work you're doing, whether that's a 2-page comic or a 200-page comic. That's where I'm really thankful for the slow pace, the methodical pace that goes into making long form comics work. It really gives you a chance to arrive somewhere that's different from where you started. The main impetus for Save It for Later, going back to your talk about feelings, actually, was just that social and political changes were happening so quickly, but also there were like 100 fires burning at once. And a lot of adult Americans, myself included, you catch yourself, like you're feeling anxious, afraid, doubtful, angry, that things are happening so fast, things that require your help, your attention. And so you feel this natural, a lot of people, or at least speaking for myself, there's this natural push to kind of be like, oh, well, my feelings are just my feelings, or, like, that's an entirely different thing from the work that I need to put into this, or something I need to show up for. I don't need to worry about my self-centered, navel-gazing fears. So I think by the end of 2017, I was like, we haven't really been given much chance to kind of like look back or breathe or even share things that we're afraid and anxious and doubtful about. We're going to be in a lot of trouble on a societal level if we don't carve out some space to be like, it's okay to talk about these private, subjective things that are happening in your family, in your house, as a result of just being people living in this country during so much upheaval. And really, I was like, for me, that's what comics are for. And so that's what I originally set out to kind of do, this fast, raw, emotional book. And then it kind of found its home and wound up being something more and something different.
Yeah. And people forget, I mean, March and your work in a lot of cases, I mean, these are primary sources. And so, right, when we use them in the classroom, I mean, these are books that are going to live in my classroom for the next, I don't know, till whenever I have the opportunity to retire. And they will be a historical record. And I love that in that moment in time. So as we make that transition, if I could, just kind of your thoughts on, I have tons of thoughts, but your thoughts on using comic books in education. And, did you have any experiences or when you've interacted with schools in the past or students or any under that umbrella of comics and education? What are your thoughts?
Well, I had zero. I mean, I graduated from high school in '96, so I had zero comics in my educational upbringing, unless like perhaps the school police officer maybe drove up on the schoolyard with a repossessed like drug dealer's Camaro, and then had some like McGruff the Crime Dog comics that he threw at everybody. Like, unless it was that, there were no comics. Like, you know, by the first half of the '90s, you know, that's the era in which Mouse, you know, got the Pulitzer, which is really one of the first shots fired in terms of comics ongoing perpetual battle for the legitimacy of the medium. But on the other side of it, so the other part of that is like growing up in pre-internet Arkansas, I literally did not have any idea there were comics that weren't superhero comics until I left Arkansas for college. And so my experience, like my personal path in telling stories through comics and expressing myself about things that matter, was very much dependent on leaving a more limited cultural environment, and then bringing what I learned back to Arkansas. But yeah, really, until March Book One was published, including the time I was spending making March Book One, for that entire first 20 years of my life making comics, I never once considered the potential readership of anything I did. In fact, I had kind of a snooty author's approach to it, where I was like, well, I'm just going to make the exact book that I'm going to make for me. But it carried with it all of these assumptions that, like, well, the book gets printed and then it winds up on bookshelves and people they find the book and they read it, right? And really, it wasn't until March Book One was released that I finally started to have interactions with, and I mean this in the positive sense of the term, the gatekeepers of the books that wind up on shelves in libraries and classrooms and bookstores, the people who put the effort into sticking up for books, but also at times put a degree of risk in their own careers and livelihoods to stick up for certain books. And so getting to hear from people specifically about why March Book One, for example, was worth standing up for in their middle school library or in their classroom, why it was worth putting up with challenges from, you know, mildly ruffled parents, or whatever. Not only did it make me understand that there's a much more interconnected web of people who work to make resources and make accounts like this survive the test of time. And by that, I mean just staying on shelves. But it made me understand the specific risks that the March trilogy faced. I really frankly, I entered, you know, 2012, I entered my job drawing March Book One being like, well, I mean, I'm gonna give it my 110%, but I was like, this is a nonfiction first person historical account about the first salvos, you know, of activism in the civil rights movement. I was like, this is a pretty uncontroversial book. And as we went on into March Book Two, and I started hearing more about doubts and challenges and complaints and stuff, that sort of, you know, parallels this rapidly increasing shift to the right in terms of cultural currency and just volume, and making me recognize that the fact that March was comics, and that being a separate thing that we sort of had to stick up for in terms of legitimacy, presented a particular weak spot, which certain parties would have an interest in exploiting to kind of discount the books, especially as they became like the preeminent means by which a new generation of people learns about the civil rights movement. But not only, you know, to discount the books, but thus to discount the history itself. And that's the kind of thing where in 2012, if like Bill and Ted style, if future past me would have come out of a phone booth and warned me about this, I'd be like, that's absurd. Like the general broad history of the civil rights movement is in such a safe spot. Like, who even cares to combat that? And you know, like, that's no joke. And so, like, as we move through March books 2 and 3, we had to adapt our entire creative and editorial process to make the history as bulletproof as possible, so that we could fight off, you know, any contest about historical accuracy, so that we could participate and correct the historical record wherever possible, because we knew that we already had such an uphill battle to keep this on shelves and in people's hands.
And I, you know, when we first brought in March, I met you guys at San Diego Comic-Con a few years ago. I'm sure you remember.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah. But I had some of the same fears when I pitched this to my curriculum director, because we had never used graphic novels in the classroom. You know, and it was funny because I was asked, do you have any evidence for the efficacy of graphic novels in the classroom? And I said, well, actually, yes, my master's thesis paper so I turned that over to her, and God bless, she was willing to go for it. And we have had parents challenge the book, and they challenge the book because John Lewis is a Democrat. And so when I have them come into my classroom and they read when they actually read the Marx books, I don't know how you all did it, but it's a political book, but it's not political. It's not divisive. You're not bashing Republicans. You're not, you know, just a total Democrat love fest. This is, and I would say for March, the most powerful part of it is it empowers students. You know, when you talk about SNCC and it's, well, what can I do? You know, in the Children's March and all these things that are in these books in such an engaging way. It's not just Martin Luther King Jr. It's not just Rosa Parks. It's so much more inclusive. And I've never had a parent walk away, conservative or liberal, upset with the books once they've actually sat down and read it. So yes, I think you absolutely, this is a book that can be used in any classroom. And yes, books get challenged all the time, and we do the best that we can. But these books also encourage our students to do more research.
Certainly.
Yeah.
And what you're saying is absolutely true. And a lot of that is to Congressman Lewis's credit. Simply the fact that he all of us were very mindful of this, but he was very good at keeping us kind of corralled with a couple of very clear mandates. One was that the history of which he was at the center, the history of direct action through the young people's wing of the movement, was based upon a non-hierarchical approach to activism and social change. And so he was very aware, you know, that he was a lionized hero, and figurehead of the movement. But he's like, more or less, there's no point in telling this history in this way if we're not going to make sure we're recentering that history, so that it's not, as Andrew would say, a story of gods and kings. That simply is not the actual history of the movement. A lot of our work on March had to do with recognizing what the erroneous assumptions we all have carried about the movement, and kind of combating those directly simply by telling the history. Congressman Lewis would always we'd have a lot of nuanced discussions, you know, every few weeks about a different subject or different approach to making the books. And one of his mantras was simply like, we've got to tell the story. We've got to tell the whole story. We've got to make it plain. We have to, like, by that meaning unobscured, not simple, but, you know, lay it out in a plain way. And in terms of partisanship, that was one of my concerns going into the project, like late 2011, early 2012. Even though the congressman and Andrew and I were on the same page politically, to me, you know, I think there should understandably be a level of discomfort in as you're approaching doing a creative endeavor with, you know, a sitting politician. And but, you know, like within a day, once I was reading the script, reading through his memoir, and understanding exactly not only where his historical perspective was in terms of his life story, but even the framing device through the March trilogy, being the 2009 inauguration day, and the ways in which Congressman Lewis was sort of traveling through time, but over the physical space of the National Mall on that day. And the physical representation of the long arc of history, going from the back Capitol steps with the inaugural platform, moving across, from the Lincoln Memorial, these sort of subtle, quiet reminders. I think those were the most powerful visual symbols that we're able to do, that sort of allowed me as a creator, but hopefully allow readers to absorb, you know, a political transition and celebrating a political transition without making it inherently partisan.
And the panels and things that you mentioned, and I'll get to those. You are the master at opening books. Like, I mean, your openings to your books but the wordless panels in your work are some of the most amazing, meaningful panels that I've ever seen from any artist. And when we're teaching about textual and visual evidence in our classrooms, when we want our students to pick apart political cartoons and primary sources, and like, we zero in on this. And this is why we need to teach our kids how to read a comic book.
Yes.
Because a lot of kids have never read one before, which just breaks my heart.
A lot of adults have never read one.
Right. And so sometimes kids will skip, the readers will skip, well, there's no words on this page, so I don't have to read it.
Sure.
But once we delve deeply into your work, it's okay. And then they become better readers. They become better writers. They become better historians in picking apart, like I said, political cartoons and primary sources. So it's awesome.
Well, a lot of the strength, I think, of gaining comics literacy simply has to do with noticing. Like, it's funny because, I don't read book reviews on like Amazon or Goodreads or anything anymore. But back in the day, like I still read a couple in 2013 or so. And I particularly enjoyed, I would only read the 1-star reviews of like March Book 1. And I'd be like, I can't wait. And some of it would be like about the lettering size. And a lot of it's just like people, acclimating to the way comics are made. But there are also other parts that were very telling and actually kind of affected and informed my work going forward. My favorite 1-star review was simply that, like, this is 120 pages of comics, but it's actually only about 10 pages of information. It's a waste of money. And because I've been reading comics since I was 3, it has never occurred to me how widely shared the misreading of comics is, in which you're still, it's a combination of words and images, but people are still looking to words for information. And it really is a big hump to get over if you haven't arrived there independently. The fact that there's a ton of nonverbal information. And in fact, like, the script to March Book 1 was much more robust. And I personally had to trim certain amounts. A lot of that's the process of Andrew and I learning to work together, learning to write and draw for each other. But a lot of it was avoiding redundancies. A lot of it was being able to show things in a way that didn't require writing it out. But when you do that, you're able to cross some of those narrative components which divide the reader from the material. And so when comics do their job correctly, it allows us as readers to really become the person behind the camera, or become the narrator. And in the case of March, it really allows us to push a reader into a position where they are ready for empathy and for sympathy. They are ready to experience things as close to the person at the center of the action as possible. And sometimes I would flip that and unexpectedly would force a reader into a position in which they're seeing things through the point of view of a white supremacist combating anti-racist protesters and activists. And a lot of that was doing that for myself and recognizing that when I have to sit at the table and draw from the perspective of someone punching John Lewis in the face, that I feel repulsed and I feel a kind of physical sickness. And if I do my job correctly, you know, I should feel that and you should feel that. And so a lot of that is like just being mindful of how each panel makes me feel, and recognizing that that has value, even if it's only pictorial, even if there's no text involved.
I never even thought of it from the artist perspective. I'm definitely bringing that up with my with my students when we get into March again next year. That's very powerful. And I just wanted to say, like you were saying, growing up, and I know like Andrew tells a story about how his English teacher took his comic books away from him when he was in school, and it was something for me. The moment was for me. It was I had Miles Morales had just come out, and so I've always been in the hip hop and growing up in Philly. I talked about, Chuck
Yeah.
D and all that, but I would never talk about comic books because I was afraid I get, my rear end beat handed to me. And that has since changed. But here I am. I'm like, oh, I'm going to talk about comics in my classroom, as when Miles Morales first came out. And I had this kid, this young black man in my classroom. He's 17. And we had never really talked much. Just, I'm pretty shy myself. And he came up after class. He wanted to talk about Miles Morales. So this kid was more impressed that that Spider-Man looked like him than the fact that we had a black president, right? Like, and so what we're seeing in March, we're seeing our heroes and what we're seeing in pop culture now, and it does fill me with a lot of hope, that Lando Calrissian isn't the only diversity that we're seeing anymore. And so just absolutely. So I'm actually going to flip ahead because you kind of touched on a few things. And if we have time, we'll come back to. It's cool. I've got March in several different languages that I use in my classroom to teach, because you can use graphic novels to teach languages too, because you've got that built-in scaffolding. And if right here, and I can put it in the chat later, this tiny URL, if you want to take a screenshot or whatever, if you're interested, those are all of my, it's a Google Doc of all my March teaching resources, if anybody wants those. But I want to leave time for some questions and things too. So these are, the fact that my kids got to meet you all, I was first in line.
Right.
And what killed me was, I was invited to present, and my presentation was at the library, which of course is down the road from the convention center. And don't you know, when I presented was when you all had your panel. So here I come from all the way across the country and I missed your panel. I'm like, I am not missing the signing. So you all just talked to my kids like there was nobody else there in the chaos of San Diego Comic-Con. And I have to say, these 3 signed books that I have are absolutely my most prized possession. And poor John Lewis, he's talking about his hand hurt from, the signings and, but just that, I said, you're literally, and I say this to my own students, you're literally shaking like Martin Luther King Jr.'s hand. Like it's on that level. And so I share these pictures with my own students. It's just an amazing experience. I've written multiple articles about using March in the classroom. This here's another tiny URL will take you to this PBS article. But literally when I'm asked, and I'm asked, usually when I'm interviewed, it's the number one question: who's your favorite superhero? What's your favorite comic? And John Lewis is both. John Lewis, right? March is my favorite comic, and John Lewis is my favorite superhero. And so, like you said before, it's not just about capes and tights and that, although those stories are great too, but comics have evolved so much. And so this is part of the program that I am with, like I said, Jackie and lots of other inspirational educators around the world, where we're using comics to teach about finding your own voice and solving local and international issues. And so we're going to use March. So this legacy just will continue to go on. And so for me, that's solace that although John Lewis isn't here, the work that you all have done will live on in our classrooms for such a long time. I don't know, Nate, have you heard of Project Lit? Like, do you know? Okay. So I'm a Project Lit advisor. My kids are in Project Lit. And so these are some of the graphic novels that we read. And the fact that they're being taught in the classrooms, the fact that, we've got all kinds of different issues that we're able to talk about in our classroom through graphic novels. So I just thought I'd put that out there too. If you're not a Project Lit member, if you want to be, feel free to reach out or find them on social media. It's from Jared Amato, who started this. It is a countrywide book club. So again, so we were talking about the work that you had done and how images add to the story. And so I used to, when I first taught March and I felt badly, I had like this giant packet of questions to answer. And it was totally the wrong approach. Now what I do is I give the kids sticky notes and I say, just put a sticky note in when something jumps out at you, a question that you have, an interaction that you have. And pages like this come up over and over again. Like you can write about how, this trial wasn't going to go the way that they needed to go, that this trial was unfair. But when you see the judge turn around, when you see your lettering kind of, he can't even hear, he's ignoring what's going on. When we see, the sweat coming off the politician's face, when he's saying one thing, but he obviously feels a different way. And then the end of March book 1, and I say to my kids, like, well, what's going to happen next? Is there like, well, there's a March book 2. So of course we know it's going to continue. But although we have legislation, although we have movement, although we have laws, when you look at the white folks' faces, when you look just there, and when you look at the worried faces here, just that in and of itself. So you can read 5 pages about this trial in prose. In 2-3 panels, I got it. And so your work is amazing for that it, again, like you said, it emotionally involves our kids. And so these are just some of the images that I took from my students, just the idea of how we do the word balloons, right? And so it's angry. And then we've got, it's in bold and it's underlined. So even that, and then the chill, right? Like you'll have to leave. But again, looking on their faces. And so my students will ask questions. The anger on her face. And so, we always talk about how optimistic and full of love John Lewis was. And my students are like, how could he possibly be optimistic about how things were going to go? And I didn't put it on here, but there's another image. I think it was from Birmingham. I forget now, but where when the crowds come out to rush the buses, and there's like a child, the mom has a child in her hands. And that's when we talk about that. My kids zero in on it all the time. Like, these people didn't just go away. This wasn't that long ago. This is my grandparents' time, or in our case, our parents' time. And it's that, again, you can read it in a couple sentences. It doesn't have that impact that a graphic novel does. Just, again, you can write about what happened, but when you see the tears in his eyes, and, the bombing of the Baptist church. And so I really appreciate how you drew what happened to Emmett Till. I really appreciate how, right, it's not graphic, if you will. It's not every stroke that you have in these books is very well thought out. And so we can use these books on multiple levels, from middle school to high school. And like I said, I use it with my own kids in elementary school. And because of that, so it's approachable, and it's not going to turn the reader off. But again, it's going to make them remember.
The depiction of Emmett Till in March Book 1, that was actually the panel that opened up our internal discussions about what the execution of the book would look like, simply because I knew that I had a lot of it is like the intersection between storytelling and vision and 2 conflicting kinds of responsibility, particularly knowing the history of Emmett Till's life and death, but also his mother's choice to have an open casket funeral so that the world could see what white supremacists did to her son. And talking it over with Congressman Lewis, and recognizing that if I have to and am going to draw the body of this teenage boy who's been murdered, finding a line that would be accurate in depicting his body, that would neither be dry nor sensational. My older daughter started requesting reading March right after she turned 4. And a lot of those first save it for later sequences that Tim showed are kind of giving a brief recap of that process of like reading it through 4 or 5 times with her over the course of a couple of years to finish the trilogy. But it took several times through, like, when you're reading with someone, even as young as 4, my 4-year-old, who is a mindful, sensitive person, like she's able to get through it and absorb it. It involves being mindful and curating the reading experience so that you're understanding that person's worldview at their level, and you're able to deliver what's in March, for example, at their level. And a lot of that was, she wasn't fully literate yet. Now she's hyper literate. And so like a lot of it, I was lucky that I'm familiar with the content because I co-made the content, but a lot of it has to do with not pushing the level of complexity of certain things until they've gotten the fundamentals. And then when you're rereading and reprocessing, you're able to add more layers onto it. But that panel depicting Emmett Till's body was, I believe, the only panel in the first book that I covered up the first couple of times we read the book. And then at a certain point, I knew that she was ready. But yeah, like even on a parental or an educational, from that standpoint, it involves accepting responsibility as the curator of the information. It requires staying on top of sort of a mindful approach to where your kids or where your students are at their level, and then not dumping a bunch of super intense stuff on them without being aware of like the benefits of giving them a certain level, and then being able to circle back. That's part of the magic of comics, is the fact that you are, regardless of what kind of comic it is, you're able to time travel within the book. You're able to read and process things, and if something grabs you, you're able to stop right there and cross-reference something that just happened. You're able to reread. You're able to move through things if they're not relevant at the time. It's an incredible, like, I'm secretly trying to control my readers with the tricks that I do as a cartoonist, but the reader has an incredible amount of control over their experience with what they're reading. And I think we tried as hard as we could to have room for both of those levels of control so that people could process the history and the account as best they could.
As an educator, I mean, very well said. Couldn't have said any better myself. The only thing I would add on to that is the visual component, the connections that my students can make. We use Kyle Baker's Nat Turner graphic novel in my classroom, wordless graphic novel. And they're like, wait a minute, this is like what happened in the Jewish Holocaust. Wait a minute, this is, I mean, our kids, we are bombarded with visual images, so much so. And it is, I don't see the same response when you're reading a textbook or when you're reading, those kinds of things. But when we annotate Public Enemy in my classroom, and then we compare it to J. Cole,
Wow.
I mean, these are the things, right, that stick with our kids. And then we take a look at the music that's mentioned in the March graphic novels, and the power of music in the community and to make change. And pop culture is so powerful, so powerful.
Yeah.
So what I have my students do is I encourage them to stop, like you're saying sometimes, stop, reflect. What do you think is going to happen next? And so it doesn't have to be, I mean, I'm not a great artist, but some of my students who may not be the best writers, I mean, we all have different strengths and weaknesses, and when they do these things, but again, I mean, this is more my level here, and these are my students that I could share these. But like you said, when they are doing the drawing, when they are reflecting, and when they are stopping and not just reading through, and when they do these things, that pen to paper, we know those mental connections. And so I use this in my 11th grade classes, and surly teenagers excited about coming in, and it's the most amazing experience. We've had block days. The kids come in. I've got reading chairs around the room. We sit down. I put my feet up on the desk. I reread March every year, and I have different reflections on it every year. Wow. And we just talk. There's no test. We don't need it for this. I don't know if you can see, we've got pictures of John Lewis up around the room, and it says, what would John do?
Oh, I
Right?
see.
Yeah, what would John do? And so when there's issues in the classroom, we reflect on that. But we can also use online tools like Pixton. And so what my students do is we read March, and then I have them research a modern civil rights issue. Because again, civil rights did not start or end. It's an ongoing issue. And we've actually worked on these comics with students in other countries too. And so you can take away that art phobia, if you will, sometimes by using like an online tool. And so the kids do the research. They write an annotated bibliography. They write an essay, but they also create a comic. And sometimes they can have a little fun with it. That when we talk about healthcare, and so the Stegosaurus doesn't have access to healthcare. So, all right, why is that? But it's filled with facts. 33 million Americans didn't have healthcare in 2015. So like you said, it's that creation part of it and education that we can't forget. So I want to be mindful of your time, and I want to get to at least a couple of questions. And I know you had mentioned Two Dead. Because my son will kill me if I don't ask you this question.
Go for it. Yeah.
So he really excitedly, my kids love Greek mythology, and they love Rick Riordan, and they love all the books. And he's like, Dad, this is Nate Powell. And we read it together, and absolutely. So he wanted me to ask you, like, what was that like? Because this is something totally different.
Oh yeah. Well, oddly, I think I signed the contract to do March and The Lost Hero the same week, and it was like the week before I became a dad. A lot of things happened in like December 1st, 2011, basically. And I've been friends with Rob, who wrote the adaptation of The Lost Hero. He's done a lot of top shelf books and stuff previously. But for me, like I drew The Lost Hero while I was doing March books 1 and 2. And a lot of times, like especially with March book 2, as the content got intense, disturbing, depressing at times, or really even just like the grueling grind of doing the really non-fiction-y parts of the book, they're like, this happened and this happened. Here's a bunch of lettering. It really helped to switch gears for a couple of days and draw, like metal dragons fighting sorcerers and demon cyclopes and stuff. In a lot of ways, the comic that changed my life, or the comics, were basically Chris Claremont's entire run on all of the X-Men and X-related books. So for me, I was pretty much just imagining that I was drawing an X-Men or a New Mutants title during all of this. And it just made it so much fun. We had a little bit of interaction with Rick Riordan himself. The only thing, he gave me a lot of freedom in terms of the character designs, locations. The only thing that he weighed in on at all was I turned in a bunch of drawings, and then he wrote back specifically to say, I just want you to know, I showed my son, I believe, your design for Festus the dragon, and he was so psyched that basically, like, my own son is the one who's signing off on the dragon design. Go for it. And I was like, that's the endorsement that matters. It's funny because that came out in 2014, and besides March, it was definitely like the biggest selling book I had ever done. But because of the general readership of the book, I was like, for many years, I was like, it's weird, like 100,000 copies of this book sold, and I've never met a single human who has ever read the book, because I don't know any 11-year-olds. But maybe in 2018, I started doing some talks at schools for like governor's school programs and at colleges. Finally, those 11 and 12-year-olds were in 12th grade or college. And so I would do little slideshows like, yeah, I did this thing, I did this. And then I'm like, oh yeah, and I did The Lost Hero, and like roaring, like passionate applause. And I'm like, finally, they're adults. I was like, finally, I've met the people who have read this book. And it was nice to remember that like people who love to read are lifelong readers. And at a certain point, these can be touchstones, or at least it's going to get them where they're going. And so it's really nice to have new dialogues about this very entertaining book that I did. You know, it was a part of my job, and it was fun and creative. But it's nice now that, you know, that's a part of a lot of younger people's experiences into the world of, you know, adulthood.
How cool is that? That I say it to authors all the time. That the lifelong impact you're having on people, it is amazing. So, I know you had shared on social media Two Dead in particular, which blew me away. So, if real quickly, and then we'll get to questions, but I wanted to have a chance for you to talk about it because you sent me on a path of research, you know, based on a true story, and some of it just seemed absolutely unbelievable. And I don't know why I thought it would be unbelievable, but two police forces, and you know, all these kinds of things. But I, you know, again, it's not just about March. But if you would talk a little bit about this, because
Sure.
um, just the idea of when, you know, our soldiers are coming back, and the things that had happened, and again, the civil rights movement didn't just start in the '60s.
That's right. Yeah, I mean, Two Dead is a work of fiction that is pretty closely based on a bizarre, um, a bizarre murder suicide that happened within the Little Rock police force. Little Rock's my hometown. My friend Van used to work for the paper there, and he worked the crime beat. And while he was, you know, spending every day down at the police station, he found a plaque, basically that that was like in memory of a certain head detective, and its absence of certain kinds of information led him on this journey to get to the bottom of this incredible tale of, you know, undealt with trauma, uh, and PTSD, not only from World War II, but larger social shifts. So like a hyper segregated police force in a mid-sized southern city, but also like, to me, like a lot of it's there's a lot of like big moral questions in the book, but the historical backdrop is really, has always been interesting to me. Uh, Most importantly, 1946 and 1947, in which the United States involvement in World War II, uh, by mobilizing so many largely young white men for the, you know, for active duty in the forces, resulted in a lot of employment and civil gains within women across America, within the Black workforce. And then as soon as World War II was over, there was a very quick push to basically put the genie of a more democratized nation back in the bottle. And so there are a lot of rumblings, like even in 1941, that's when A. Philip Randolph, you know, one of the principal architects and organizers of the March on Washington, threatened and started organizing for an initial March on Washington. Um, but this also coincides with a housing bubble bursting in 1947, very similar to 2007. It has to do with a lot of labor unrest and strikes occurring in 46 and 47. And they're basically revealing a lot more turbulence that was happening on a social and political level, especially as American involvement in World War II opened a lot of doors which could and should never be closed again. But specifically in a time in which, you know, PTSD was not a word, an acronym, or a definition, and probably wouldn't be for another generation. A lot of these are the impacts not only of like the trauma of war, but also the trauma of institutionalized racism, of segregation, of white supremacy. And so there are a lot of couplings throughout the book. There are pairs of different kinds, domestic and professional, who are butting heads with each other. And so a lot of the cast is simply these sets of two who are mirroring and combating against and kind of reconciling with each other. But yeah, it's you know, wound up being a very haunting thing to make, and I'm really proud of it. I think it's a good example of fiction that works to tell a more tightly wound truth, while being free from the strict historical constraints if it would have been done as nonfiction.
Yeah, agreed. And I have to say, sadly enough, when because I was like, oh, I want to learn more about this, and when I started doing the research, the same um, police force, it was current event articles with some of the same issues.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. And so it's that idea of what really has changed. And so when we talk about systematic racism, right? So your legacy of work does all that. So I'm going to stop the share here. Again, the purpose, well, so many purposes, but if you weren't here in the beginning, Save It for Later is out on April 6th from Nate Powell. And again, I literally saw myself in this book, if you missed the very beginning. And it fills us with hope, in which we don't always have the last few years. Highly suggest that you buy it. I love that I was able to read it a little bit ahead of time. But Nate, I really, I mean, I'm kind of fanboying is not the right word, but I just have the utmost respect for you and Andrew. And I really thank you for everything that you've done, and for agreeing
to do it. It's
Yeah.
all that I know. It's all that I know how to do. I can parallel park well also, but yeah, generally it's drawing comics.
So if you wouldn't mind, if maybe another 10 minutes or so, if anybody has any questions, it's always interesting. You can throw it in the chat, or you can unmic yourself and we can fight it out. Either way is fine. I think there's Jennifer. I think you were nice enough to put your virtual hand up. Did you want to ask a question?
Actually, I was just clapping, saying that I love I love both Tim and Nate. I follow you guys on social media, and so I've only been teaching March in my classroom. Hey, stop! My kids are all over here. Only been teaching it for the last about 5 years, and I started with a group of 10th graders teaching it, but I recently moved down to middle school. And so now I teach 7th graders, but I still use March. And then we recently paired it with I Am Alfonso Jones, and kind of talking about what you were talking about, Tim, that the civil rights movement didn't start and end in the 50s and 60s. I love you too. I actually put in the a question online before we started about what others, either for Tim or Nate, other suggested pairings would you suggest for specifically 7th graders? Is Silence of Our Friends a little too much for them? Is that more high school level? Because I'm able to get parent permission on most of the stuff that like is maybe controversial. Like right now we're reading Mexican White Boy by Matt De La Pena, and it's got lots of curse words in it, but they're cool with it because it's about them. Sure. So it's all about representation.
Silence of Our Friends, it really, content-wise, I think, yeah, in terms of objectionable content, it's really just language
okay.
as well. When we made that book also, that was like really I always, really all my books, with the exception of moving through the March trilogy, all of my books I selfishly considered as being for adults because I was an adult making the book. However, The Silence of Our Friends is like 95% autobiographical from the perspective of Mark, the primary writer, being like a 9-year-old kid in 67, 68. And so a lot of the perspectives are, I think they're challenging and interesting because they sort of present the plainness and the bluntness by which certain levels of casual racism went unquestioned, particularly in, suburban, predominantly white life in the 60s. But by putting yourself through this 9-year-old kid's eyes, we're able to sense and feel his discomfort, his growing dis-ease, and his line of questioning to his parents and to his friends around him, and like sort of drawing lines between himself and the other kids on his block and his friends. I think there's a really good challenge in there. I don't think that the plot as it occurs, like the historical, like the hate crimes and protests that happened in Houston in 67, in 68. I don't think that's too complex within the book or over the heads of anyone, but it does read like, I mean, it's a graphic novel. It's like 95% based on historical real events from a person who was there. But that's sort of like a lot of it is like recognizing there's power the closer you get to having this reading experience that's more guiding you through in the way that we experience a movie or reading a novel. But recognizing that Silence of Our Friends, for example, sits in a gray area. So
Mm-hmm.
in that way, it very much reads like a novel, and just having like a mindfulness of like, you know, there's an afterword in that book where Mark's basically like, yeah, the reason this isn't nonfiction is because we had to condense and truncate some events and smush them into a shorter period of time simply so we could make this 200-page book out of it.
Yeah.
And then that had a couple of other little ramifications, but you know, his intention was to tell his experience, his family's experiences, etc. So I'd say like being mindful of that little gray area, I think gets you over a lot of those humps. There's nothing particularly challenging in the content though that would get you in hot water or present roadblocks to like reading the material.
And I would say I should get a document camera at some point, but there's this really well done part in the book where, because of what the family's going through, the father takes it out on his son. And you kind of see that dynamic too. So again, that's that wordless personalization that Nate does so well. The only thing I would add to that, and I think this is appropriate too, is what's funny is in the United States, you can have as much violence in these books as you want,
Mm-hmm.
no problem. You can have all kinds of curse words in prose books, no problem. But an image will get you into hot water as an educator so much faster than anything else. So that's only the advice I always give is you got to be careful with the images sometimes. And
right. I have to look for like overly sexualized content and things like that.
That's the killer, right? You can beat people up, you can, right? But I would also say, because I noticed another one of my favorite people is here, but Joel Christian Gill is here, and
oh, awesome.
Yeah, this is an adult version, but Fights I can't recommend enough.
Yes.
But in my classroom, I use his Talented 10th and Strange Fruit graphic novels. And what's great about those is they're short stories about people in Black people in history that your students have probably never heard of. They're very much appropriate for middle school, elementary school, and on up on different levels. And I use them in my classroom to inspire my own kids to create their own graphic biographies. So I can't teach everything, you know, every year. So I rely on my students to do the research and create. And so the work that Joel does is also a really powerful part of my classroom. All right. Does anybody
else?
Oh, Jackie.
Hi. I don't really have any questions. I just wanted to say thank you for this hour, Tim and Nate. It's been so inspiring. In my program, we've greatly enjoyed using March this time to work with global educators and spread the message that's in March and inspire them to create their own memoirs about their own global and local and regional civil rights that are occurring in worldwide. And wow, it's your work is so amazing and it's touching so many people. And I wanted to say thank you.
Well, I'm happy to do it. And, you know, I feel lucky every day that this is what I get to spend my time and energy doing. So thank you for the work you're doing on your end. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Jackie. Deb had a good question in the chat. Do you recommend multiple copies of the same book or single copies of multiple comics? This idea of limited funds in the classroom. So March is actually the only graphic novel that I have a class set of. What I do have is a huge classroom library, and I should be in perfect shape because I'm always schlepping books back and forth to work and everything. My students in normal times sit at tables of 4. And so what I find even more powerful sometimes is each kid has a different book, but on the same topic, right? It's really easy to make a connection to, like, anyway, behind me, but like George Takei's They Call Us Enemy, right? About the Japanese American internment camps and civil rights issues for African Americans. And so those are the connections we want to make. And again, we can then get across 30 different stories in a time frame of one class period a lot of times, where if you were to teach each novel individually, there just wouldn't be enough time. So I do it both ways, and I find value in doing it both ways. And yeah, the limited funds there are things like, I don't know if you heard of like Library Pass. There are, online libraries that you can use. Go to your librarian, like they're the ones with the budget. And Library Pass has a really great growing graphic novel selection, including all three of the March trilogy. In fact, I went in to look for the March trilogy when I got a trial from them, and I found 15 other books in there just on African American civil rights issues. So, and as many students as want to use it at one time can. So Comics Plus, Library Pass, look them up, and maybe talk to your librarian about that. That's always a good option too. All right.
Yeah, to add to that, internationally too, if you're trying to cross connect your classes with international classes, Library Pass is a really good solution for getting the same materials available. We've done a pilot with, gosh, how many countries? 30 or 40 countries using Library Pass this year, and it's worked in every single country. So they're actually able to read March. So it's got an amazing model of access worldwide.
Yeah, in this age of digital education and everything, which I don't think is going anywhere, completely gone, it's been invaluable. Does anybody else have a comment or a question? Again, you can just unmute yourself.
I just want to say hello. Hey, Nate, how you doing? Hey,
Bill.
Tim, how you doing? How are y'all?
How's it going there?
Good.
Excellent, man. An excellent surprise to see you today.
I had it on my calendar. I got work going on in the other room, so I had to leave my room and come back here so I could say hello. So it's good to see you. Great talk. And the book is fantastic. I told you before, I thought it was amazing. And if you guys have not picked it up or pre-ordered it, like, get on it. I'm just sad that I can't get a pre-ordered signed to Joel copy.
Well, I have connections, so I may be able to send one of those your way.
Well, I pre-ordered one from the bookstore when you put it out there. Yeah, so I pre-ordered that. So I pre-ordered that one. So I think I have March book 1 is signed by all three of you. And then I think book 3 is signed by Andrew and book 2 is signed by you. So, because I would see everybody, but yeah, it's like good to see you. Hope that we can see each other in real life soon.
You bet, man.
I was just going to say that.
Approaching.
Yeah, I can't wait to get back to conventions and get my signatures and see my folks. Ugh. Thanks, Joel. And again, I love using your work in my classroom. It's fantastic. Anybody else? Because I don't want to keep Nate too much longer. We're running a little bit over, which is great, because if we were like a Comic-Con, there'd be the person up there with 5 minutes, 2 minutes, right? You got to leave. So this is kind of nice. We don't have to deal with that. But anybody with a last minute question or a comment?
Yeah, I wanted to love March, and I had quite a few years ago, I had done a bunch of children's books about Arkansas history that we had sold to the school programs, and we put as characters the writers' grandkids so that the students would have someone to relate to as we're telling this history. And I thought it was interesting with March how you introduced the kids coming to the offices at the beginning. Was that like consciously done so that the kids would have someone immediately to relate to?
I think that was largely that's to Andrew's credit. So one of the few things in the March trilogy that is not strictly factual is that those two kids, Jacob and Esau, are, an amalgamation of what Andrew describes as, like hundreds of kids who have come to visit the office over the course of years and years, but the ways in which, like, sort of basically being able to streamline each one of those hundreds of kids' experiences into the general space of arriving in Congressman Lewis's office, but also the natural questions that pop up. And really, like, a lot of that was getting back into like mindfulness and, you know, like taking time when you're reading and looking at a comic to notice things, was the fact that, you know, mom has her kids that she's bringing in. It's right before the inauguration. She's like, oh, I'll get out of your hair. But the kids are taking everything in the office where it's like, no, I want to show you this stuff. And they are the ones who notice this multitude of tiny little chicken sculptures and paintings, not the adults, where like we all had, you know, our detail binoculars just like whittled away from us in life. So a lot of that is like getting into the mindset where they're like, we can't help but notice all of these things. What does this mean? Does this mean this? Does this mean this? What about this? How did you feel about that? And yeah, a lot of that is really like guiding us into a position where like, yes, you need to be listening to the things that the young people notice and the questions they ask. And really like Congressman Lewis was so gracious with people's time and attention, would always answer people's questions, but he would like stop a train on the tracks to answer any kid's question. And basically it's just like, go away. What is it you'd like to know? And a lot of that, like that was personally important to him, that like we're going to introduce this by kids noticing and asking. And obviously it functions as a narrative device, you know, because those are an amalgamation of real people functioning, you know, to get us into the history. But yeah, it was of specific importance to Congressman Lewis that like we're setting the tone that is this is a history of young people making change, and it's the young people who are going to notice things and ask the questions.
Man, that was a great question.
It was.
Yeah. All right, so we're running over. So again, I want to say thank you to Nate. And again, we're here to talk about Save It for Later. But all of Nate's work, fantastic, full circle. If you weren't here in the beginning, I put my website in the chat, or if you go to See My Brother Dance, is it .com?
I'm a .org.
.org.
I had .com at one point. I let it slip, and then it, you know, somebody was like, pay me $2,000 and you'll get that .com. So I moved over to .org.
So see my brother dance.org. And there's even some free comics, web comics that you can use that I've used in my own classroom that you can use as well, in addition to all the books from Nate. I said to Nate, I could do an entire like teacher workshop for 3-4 hours on just his work alone. And so it's that important. And I really appreciate it, Nate. And thank you everybody for coming.
I appreciate your work too, man. Thank you.
All right.
Thanks everybody for being here. I really appreciate your time on a Saturday. Great to see you, Joel.
All right. So I stopped recording.
Thank you.